Hey guys, it's Patrice. This is A is for Alien, and today we're talking about the Reptilians. Hello everybody and welcome back to A is for Alien podcast. As you already know, my name is Patrice Johnson, and every week we navigate a different topic surrounding aliens or UFOs or abductions or cattle mutilations, everything and anything. And this week, let me tell you, it's been a tough one, and I'm not entirely confident I'm going to be able to give it justice, but as we'll probably find out throughout this series, that not every topic can be covered in 1 hour to do it completely justice. So I think that 100% this is going to be the case with this topic, reptilians, because I guess in recent years it's not just so cut and dry. There's lots of theories about reptilians out there in the world now. And, you know, this is a question that I'm going to put to you straight off the bat now, you know, is, are lizard people and reptilian aliens one and the same? Or do you think that they're both completely different? Because my kind of gut feeling feels like they're different. And I don't know how exactly to describe that. I feel like one's kind of made up and one might be true, but they both, I don't know. Do you know what I mean by that? Like, it's kind of like a strange feeling that I have about them, because obviously, you know, just to state the obvious, the elephant in the room is that when we talk about reptilian aliens, it's almost impossible to not see the words David Icke synonymous with this, because he's kind of the one who has really brought this to public attention in the past 25 years. And so, of course, we're going to have to touch on that. I don't want to focus on it too much, but it would be a lie if it wasn't something that we need to speak about, because it's obviously a huge part of this narrative of reptilian aliens. If it's particularly true, though, and the claims that he make are true, that's something which I'm on the fence about. I mean, personally, I don't believe David Icke's reptilian agenda Illuminati narrative, but do I believe that there could be reptilian-esque aliens? Maybe. And I don't know if they are one and the same or not. So let me know in the comments how you feel about it. What even before we get into the podcast and I kind of explain the history and origins, I guess, of the idea of these entities, if you think that they're different. I'm really intrigued to know. Probably getting ahead of myself though, giving away the punchline of the podcast in the first 3 minutes. So let me assure you that there is still plenty to learn and to hear in this podcast. So thank you so much for joining me, and we should just hop straight to it, I reckon. So a reptilian. What is a reptilian? There's so many names for them. Sometimes they can be called reptiloids, reptoids, archons, saurians, draconians, alpha draconians, reptilian humanoids. There's many different names for this particular entity. And there's lots of really kind of rich lore about them as well, from, you know, the kind of caste system that they have, through to how they physically look. Some of them are described as having feathers and wings. Others are just kind of, you know, reptoid looking humans. It's very varied when you start looking into this particular creature, I guess. Because then there's also the idea that they're interdimensional, fourth dimensional creatures that actually shapeshift and can appear human. So that adds an entirely new dimension to them as well, because it means that just their physical description of what they really look like, you know, may not actually be how you interact with them if you were to actually interact with them. So it's kind of confusing. And I've got to admit to you as well that whilst researching this topic, it is confusing. It's very confusing, in fact. And that probably makes sense why David Icke can do like 6-7 hour lectures on this topic, because it's almost Tolkien-esque just how deep you can get into it. I guess it's like most kind of UFO alien topics that you can be as superficial as you like or deep dive as deep as you like. And, not really get anywhere, because like you'll find, and what I'm going to go into is that there isn't a whole lot of evidence based on this. And just because an idea has been around for a really long time, that's not evidence still. That's not proof of anything. That's just, the staying power of a legend, I guess. And I think, unfortunately, the way that our world is these days, where everything is so instantaneous and we expect things instantly, that if something's been around for a long time, it kind of lends this sense of credibility to an idea, which is false. So in the circles that discuss reptilian entities, there's kind of maybe two schools of thought. The ones which are the reptilian creatures that originate on planet Earth, and sometimes they're called the Terrians. And then there are those which are said to have come from somewhere else. And probably the most commonly known and referred to of those reptilians are from Alpha Draconis, and they are sometimes called the Alpha Draconians for that reason. For full disclosure, I do need to be upfront and honest with you that a lot of the information that I find and I research comes from kind of, I guess, controversial sources. Like, because of the nature of this topic, there's no like verifiable source that this is the accurate fact. And I'm sure that by this point in the game, you realize that about this topic. But I do have to tell you and reference where I get my information from so that you can look into it yourself, because I'm sure many of you are interested in where I find my information, because it's kind of hard to find it these days. Well, not easily, like you need to know what you're looking for. A lot of the information that I'm going to recount to you about the description and nature of these creatures comes from sources such as the Krill Papers, which is, a controversial document. It surfaced in 1988. No one's really sure who the author was. Was it leaked? Bill Cooper tried to verify it. Is this the smoking gun for alien conspiracy? Who knows? So that's one of the places that I find this information. And I think for this purpose, that will be what we're referring to, at least initially. I think it's important to know, especially if you're kind of new to this game, that through the 80s and 90s, before there was really a lot of internet, like these kind of documents were distributed via things like fax or chain letters. And so a lot of people from the 80s and 90s probably will remember these kind of documents being seen, like the magic documents and the Krill report, all of that kind of stuff. And I feel like a lot of the information, I want to kind of unravel this as we get through this series, but a lot of the information and stories that people like use, such as, for example, Phil Schneider, their stories that they use are actually from reports and documents that are older than that they've kind of almost adopted. And I feel like it's unfortunate, but that really kind of limits the credibility for me, because I can find the original sources for that, because I think that that's a really important part of this, is actually questioning your source and questioning that source's source. Like that's almost part of, I guess, the academic process, is that you can't always just assume that just because someone read it in a book that book was correct. And that's what happens a lot in this. So I think what's interesting is a lot of the stuff that we talk about now in regards to aliens and to reptilians and other kind of entities is based on publications from the aliens and earlier. I think that that's a really good foundation for you to get into your mind and maybe even become familiar with those documents, because you'll be able to look at any kind of newish stories that come out with a more skeptical lens once you know where the basis of these claims kind of comes from, and that it, because I think that's the issue now, is that a lot of people come into this thinking, oh wow, these stories are so incredibly detailed, but it's been a subject that's been added to for a good 30 years or so, so it should be a good story. So who are the reptoids, the Draconians? According to this source, the reptilian race from Draco are bent on conquest. They are said to be controlling the Greys by means of an implant, the same ones that the Greys are implanting into humans. They are also said to be the masterminds behind the abduction plans. Their master plan involves using the newly created half-breeds with implants to defeat the Confederation of Humans. The reptoids also use humans as food. So underneath the umbrella term reptoids, there are obviously subcategories underneath it. So the Alpha Draconians, which is one which surprisingly, like if you Google Alpha Draconians in Google right now, you'll come up with a wiki from Resident Alien and then not a lot else, which is kind of interesting to me. Because I'm like, only 10, 15 years ago, you could Google something like that and come up with heaps of stuff about it. But that's kind of all just been, I guess, wiped off the internet, maybe. So think about that what you will. But the Alpha Draconians are reptilian beings who are said to have established colonies in Alpha Draconis. Like all reptilians, they claim to have originated on Terra thousands of years ago. They use this fact to justify their presence on Earth. Then there are the subtype called chameleons, who are reptilians genetically bred to enable themselves to appear human. They are infiltrators who can look remarkably human, although retaining reptilian or saurian internal organs. They are sometimes described as looking bulged eyes with scaly, hairless skin behind their disguise. One report alleges that the chameleons may utilize artificial lenses to conceal slit pupil irises. Some claim they are genetically bred mercenaries in a planned invasion takeover of human society. Then we have the Nagarian or the Naga, who are reptoids that apparently played significant roles in the legends of India and Tibet, where they're considered to be demonical in nature. They are described as being around 7 foot tall, various colours, most often depicted with crocodile greenish skin. They allegedly descended from a branch of bipedal sauroids that lived on the Earth thousands of years ago, and via mutation and natural selection developed the brain-body coordination necessary to develop technology. Some species reportedly still retain a tail. Apparently, after an ancient battle with high-tech human societies, they were driven into underground networks or to off-base planets such as Alpha Draconis. So now there comes a point of contention because there is also another particular type of reptilians which are called the sauroids, but they I will probably cover in another podcast episode because they are also referred to as type C greys, which are greys that are half reptilian. And that kind of describes a strange kind of symbiotic relationship, I guess, that the greys have with the reptilians, like whether or not you believe that they are kind of one and the same or not. It seems that the greys are the ones that can orchestrate the running of a country, or those kind of, they're more like the business side of things, and the reptilians are more the military arm. I think that that's probably the best way to kind of describe it simply, I guess. Although it might not seem like it now, eventually like all of the grand unified theory, the grand unified Charlie wall brings it all together in the end. Hopefully you can gather from here that the reptilians vary in descriptions and sizes, all of that kind of stuff. They originated in Earth but were forced out after a high-tech battle with humans thousands of years ago, and then they created other colonies in different places such as Alpha Draconis, and now they've come back to Earth, and slowly but surely they're trying to kind of reinvade the world. And I think that this is the part where David Icke kind of comes in, because his whole shtick, and the reason why it sounds so crazy, is that I think people really focus on that part of the narrative where he's like, they're trying to invade the world, and it just seems really insane. And a lot of time and energy is focused on that part of his narrative. And I think too that it doesn't help that the books that he sources and the information that he bases his entire kind of ideas on are, fundamentally outdated and racist. And in this day and age, people call that out. And so he gets labelled as anti-Semitic as well. And that comes back to that idea that I mentioned earlier about how just because an idea's been around for a very long time doesn't mean it's true. And through my research of this, I realised that a lot of the information that David Icke pulls upon is actually from Helena Blavatsky again, and the Secret Doctrine, and the information that it speaks about, the 7 root races, and the fact that there was a reptilian-esque nation of people that ruled on Lemuria. So this is the thing which kind of annoys me a bit, is that Helena Blavatsky claims that she wrote those secret doctrines under a trance. So once again, the information in them, which I've read parts of it, it is actually kind of a difficult document to read because there's lots of footnotes and there's lots of other annotations in it. So yeah, it's a difficult document to read. But from what I can garner from it, it does speak of 7 different root races. It talks about the reptilians in Lemuria, but once again, it's not based on anything because it was literally what she wrote in a trance. So it's essentially a work of fiction, but just because it's been around since the Victorian occultist movement days and, the Theosophical Society has it as one of their sacred texts, it doesn't mean that it's true. What is true, though, is that Helena Blavatsky was very heavily interested in South Asians and Southeast Asian cultures and religions. And that is, of course, where we get the introduction of entities such as the Naga, which are semi-divine, divine, half-human, half-serpent creatures that reside underground. They have the ability sometimes to take human form or be half-human. That's been depicted in artwork which far predates anything that Helena Blavatsky's written. Rituals devoted to these beings have been taking place for thousands of years. And it's not just isolated to those cultures either. There are stories of half-human, half-serpent entities in cultures all around the world. All around the world, and especially kind of in ancient times, like pre-biblical times, there has been this kind of common thread, I guess, of what could be considered serpent worship. Often serpents were revealed for their healing properties and the fact that they were able to shed their skin. I guess it's a physical manifestation of rejuvenation and renewal. During the Neolithic times, it seemed to experience an intense spread, with even early kind of depictions of Yahweh being depicted as a serpent. This is, of course, in a pre-biblical time when the serpent then became a symbol of an evil power and chaos. Another example of serpent worship, and potentially even one of the earliest depictions of Stone Age religion, is the Snake Rock in Botswana that is around 70,000 years old. The python-like rock has 300 to 400 carved indentations, and in flickering firelight, the patterns might have seemed like the scales were moving, which was part of some kind of sacred rite. There's also the story of China's legendary Emperor Yu the Great, where earliest legends and depictions of him describe him as being half dragon, half human. Later stories describe him as being wholly human, but said that he could take on the form of various creatures. 13 years he was able to control the treacherous floodwaters after he found out that the flooding was being caused by evil water monsters. Then he was able to travel around the country with the aid of a winged dragon who would help him drain the waters by dragging his tail along where channels were needed. I think it's these kinds of myths and legends that can be easily woven together, especially when you combined the stories of the Secret Doctrine from Helena Blavatsky and then these kind of myths and legends from all around the world. Kind of is the reason how David Icke can base his, theories on the Illuminati and the global elite and world leaders being half reptilian, because there's been myths and legends of it throughout human history. I may not realize this, but there is a lot of speculation that there was a particular interview that David Icke did with a woman called Arizona Wilder, which was kind of, the catalyst that pushed him from being maybe just your general conspiracy theorist into the lizard people, Illuminati, New World Order kind of conspiracy theorist that we know him to be today. Her maiden name was Jennifer Ann Green, and she came to prominence after the release of David Icke's The Biggest Secret. He used an interview that he conducted with Arizona Wilder called Revelations of a Mother Goddess as basically the proof for his theory that the world is dominated by shape-shifting reptilians from other dimensions. She makes some batshit insane, crazy fucking claims. And, one thing which is really interesting about this, woman is that there isn't a lot about her now that you can find. And interestingly enough as well, with the kind of prominence that David Icke has had of late, not many people speak about this interview with her and that being the reason for his theory, essentially, like the importance of this woman. So in her role as a mother goddess, she described being involved in human sacrifice rituals that involved the Pope, the Clintons, the Reagan, both George Bushes, and also various members of the royal family. Claims that her role as a mother goddess was predetermined and that she was ritually abused as part of her indoctrination through her childhood. Part of this indoctrination included being sent to trips to Moscow as a young child, being immersed in cold water to bring on near-death experiences. This was used as a method to awaken latent psychic abilities. And who was the chief handler of all of these experiments? None other than Nazi scientist Joseph Mengele. It was her testimony that introduced the idea that these creatures can't enter our planet on their own and that they need to be anchored here with sacrifice, that the adrenochrome is what is needed to keep them in human form. It was Arizona's job to preside over the ceremonies and act as a conduit for the reptilians. She claims that she was one of 3 mother goddesses in the world and that she was scheduled to be killed at 52 and her role taken over by her daughter. But after the death of Joseph Mengele in the 1980s, the psychic noose around her neck loosened and she was able to escape the cult and go into therapy. I'm going to say the Arizona Wilder story rabbit hole is a bit of a trip because she does kind of disappear after all of that time, and then she releases this missive in June of 2011 on a blog post, which isn't even her blog, but it's like a guy who's friends with her now husband. I'm in two minds about actually linking this blog post because it contains her own personal Gmail accounts and things like that. And she actually specifically states that she doesn't talk about any kind of conspiracy stuff anymore. She doesn't engage with any of that because her beliefs are that she was actually used again as a pawn and was in fact programmed in 1998 for the interview with David Icke. In her own words, she states that she decided in 1999 that she wanted and needed to go back to work. This was after she had been reported at a hospital that she works at because she was a nurse, saying that 2 patients had complained to her that she was going into their room at night during bed checks, shining a flashlight into their eyes and saying to them that Satan is going to kill you unless you go back to the cult. So then she was told that she required to be interviewed by the staff psychiatrist, and she asserted her innocence and left. So she says that in 1998 was the last time that she was kidnapped and worked on. And what she means by that is being given huge amounts of electric shock therapy, which resulted in a hospitalization. She didn't realize that she was being prepared, i.e. programmed, to do the interview with David Icke. She says that the interview took place within 5 months of her last episode, which is what she's calling her kidnapping, and she refers to the powers that be as the system, and says that the reason that she was programmed to do this interview with David Icke was to perpetrate the system's media lie and programming. She says that during the interview she was instructed not to motion or gesture with her hands, as well as the decision being made that she couldn't wear her glasses, which meant she couldn't see. She says that she was being prepared for this role in as early as 1996 and was programmed to change her name legally to Arizona Wilder after the name of a scientist who abused her and also the state in which the abuse happened. In this missive written in 2011, she said it wasn't until recently that she realized the full extent of her involvement and the victimization that she experienced. It was in 2006 that she changed her name back to Jennifer Nagel and ceased having anything to do with conspiracy circles. She said that she never wanted to be part of anything that could mislead others, and she didn't understand what compelled her to change her name to Arizona Wilder. Basically, she believes that she was genetically planned and brought into this life and assigned to the Nagel family by a scientist called Wilder Penfield, the much applauded and respected neurosurgeon based in Montreal at McGill University, who is known, along with his associate Ewan Cameron, to be involved with research on the brain for purposes of mind control, which is also referred to as MKUltra. But we've got to stay in our lane, boys, because this is an alien podcast, not a general conspiracy podcast. But I mean, it's pretty interesting read for a rainy day. And, you know, that's my challenge to you. If you're interested in this story, you know, that's the old school internet way, the internet sleuth way. Like, you've got to find it for yourself. That's why I love this game though, because it's only in this genre that you can have someone refute a claim that they made about the lizard people and say that the reason they said it was because of MK Ultra. That the lizard people story isn't true, but the MK Ultra one is. Wherever this woman is, I hope that she is doing well and that she is getting the help that she needs. I have no doubt in my mind that she believes that these things did in fact happen to her. But whether they did or not, that's probably a completely different story. But you know, regardless of whether or not the current popular theory on this particular phenomenon is correct or not, if it was based on a person who may or may not have been making it up, whether they knew that they were making it up or not, it doesn't discount the fact that there are people all around the world, in the US, in Europe, in Asia, all around the world. People have stated that they've seen these creatures, that these humanoid reptoid creatures, they've seen with their own eyes, that they've had encounters with them, not just in abduction scenario situations, but face-to-face real-world contact. So in October 2008, the British Ministry of Defence released a previously classified document which was titled simply UFO Correspondence. And before you ask, yes, I did read the 318 pages. So I was made aware of this report because of the Phantoms and Monsters website, which is run by Lon Strickler. I really dig the website. It has a lot of fun and cool stories, and it really properly covers, you know, I guess modern kind of humanoid encounters. Like the Chicago Mothman and stuff like that, the Michigan Dogman. Like, it really kind of is a great resource if you're into that kind of stuff. And if you haven't checked it out, then I really recommend that you do so. So anyway, getting back to this declassified document from the Ministry of Defence. The reason that it was on the Phantoms and Monsters website was because within this document, there was a letter which was written on the 15th of July 1991 with the subject heading UFOs. You can't tell who wrote the letter or who the letter was titled to, as that area is just completely blanked out, obviously for privacy reasons. But from what I can gather, that the writer of the letter is a UFO researcher who seems to have had correspondence in the past with this particular department, as they apologise for once again bothering them. One thing that I really enjoy about the British files is that everyone's so fucking polite to each other. In this letter, there's this interesting sentence which says, firstly, in order to importantly mention to your department, over the last 2 months or so, while requesting the return of my other UFO material from a well-respected society in Yorkshire, in the very same package, I received a very strange, highly revealing manuscript of which pertains to the alleged subterranean origin of UFOs and is represented as pure facts, eyewitness testimony and reports. The author of the paper is called Branton. That is all I know. The contents are of a revealing and concentrated nature indeed. The main overall reason as to why I have dispatched this document on loan to your department is that I believe it mentions certain strategic locations across the world that may interest your higher authority within the MOD. But to those who are not well learned or versed in this subject or field of study, then whichever light one accepts of this manuscript, it may read or sound like science fiction. A full disclosure here, for the majority of the manuscript, it does read like science fiction. And I will leave a link in the description box to the Phantoms and Monsters website, Lon Strickler's website, that you can find the links to have a look at this document yourself. You can download it and read the 318 pages that were declassified in 2008. The document that was attached has the title, The Mystery of Iniquity Exposed, or The Reality of the Serpent Race and the Subterranean Origin of UFOs by Branton. So it does get a little bit churchy. There is kind of like a spin that it's a little bit demonic. But as far as, you know, UFO lore goes, it is pretty, I guess, like, it talks about everything. It's literally like the Charlie Wall, the grand unified theory of ufology, if I'm being honest with you. But for the purpose of the topic of this podcast, there's 2 specific stories that stick out to me and became the kind of focus of my research for the past week. So in 1902, workmen were digging a well in the country of Malta when they literally fell through the earth and discovered a series of caves mostly excavated out of solid rock. This cave system descended 3 levels below the earth and later became known as the Hasaflini Hypogeum. It's terribly mysterious. Like the entire country of Malta in general is very mysterious and intriguing. It has such an incredible history, which I can't go into much depth right now about, but it's, if you're interested, especially in kind of Tudor history, that kind of thing, and the Knights of Malta and whatnot, like it is super, super duper interesting. Even as recently as World War II, the history is incredible. Like they utilized once again the caves of Malta to create battle caves essentially, and used Malta as almost an unsinkable aircraft carrier, I guess is what the kind of nickname for it was. This document references a story from the August edition of 1940's National Geographic called Wanderers Awheel in Malta. And I read it, and it's a pretty stock standard kind of National Geographic travel spread, I guess, except for this one particular paragraph at the very end, which says, many subterranean passageways, including ancient catacombs, now are part of the island's fortification and defense system. Supplies are kept in many tunnels, other are bomb shelters. Beneath Valletta, some of the underground areas served as homes for the poor. Prehistoric men built temples and chambers in these vaults. In a pit besides one sacrificial altar lie thousands of human skeletons. Years ago, one could walk underground from one end of Malta to the other. The government closed the entrances to these tunnels after school children and their teachers became lost in the labyrinth while on a study tour and never returned. I mean, that's a pretty crazy way to end an otherwise, endless travel piece. But the story doesn't end there, because almost 20 years later in 1961, in an edition of a magazine which was called Borderland Science, a lady called Lois Jessup wrote an article about her experiences and times in Malta in the mid-1930s. She claims that she visited the Hypogeum twice, once before the children and once after the children disappeared. Her story was also once again reprinted later in Dr. Allen's book Enigma Fantastique. So reading directly from the source, it says, Jessup, a former British Embassy employee, claimed that she visited Malta and the Hypogeum once before the tragic disappearance of the children and shortly thereafter. She described how on her first visit she finally convinced the guide to allow her to investigate one of the burial chambers, the supposed end of the Hypogeum tour. He seemed to know something that she didn't, but told her she could enter at her own risk. As she did, candle in hand, and her loosened sash belt being used as a guide rope for her friends who followed behind, she eventually emerged on a ledge overlooking a very deep, seemingly bottomless chasm. Below and on the other side of the chasm was another ledge leading to a tunnel or doorway, it appeared. I realise what happened next may sound unbelievable to many who read this, but I would ask them to make their own determination. Out of this tunnel, she claimed, emerged single file several very large creatures of humanoid form, but completely covered with hair from head to foot. Noticing her, they raised their arms towards her, palms out, at which point a violent wind began to blow throughout the cavern, snuffing out her candle. Then something wet and slippery, apparently a creature of a different sort, brushed past her. This all happened just as those behind her were just beginning to emerge into the cavern. They could not understand why she told them as calmly as she could, though almost screaming inside, "Oh, there's nothing here." When back in the chamber, the guide saw her expression and gave her a knowing look. About a week afterwards, the disappearance took place, and on her second visit, she saw an entirely new guide who denied that the other guide had ever worked there, although she knew that this new guide was hiding something. Put a link as well in the description box to the actual first-hand account that she wrote, because I had to find that wasn't included. It was paraphrased in the document that was in the Ministry of Defence article, but I did find the original source, and I will link that for you to have a look at as well. So the point of this story is that they allude quite heavily that the slippery thing that she touched may have been some kind of reptilian creature, and especially in the Borderland Sciences article, it does kind of go into further detail about that. It's interesting because Lois Jessup, Constant Lois Jessup, is her real name if you want to Google her and look her up. She actually was the secretary for a community called the New York Saucer Information Bureau. Something interesting that I found out about that was Ivan T. Sanderson in May 1958 reported that organization to the FBI because he believed them to be involved in subversive activity, and they were known for requesting people write to their local congressmen and stop secrecy about the government. So I just found that really, really bizarre that Ivan T. Sanderson, of all people, reported them. I think the reason why it's important that to recognize why they are alluding to this Malta incident as being reptilian is because depending on like what you believe the history of the hypergeum to be, like there's, it's all kind of, I'm not quite sure what the, accepted science says about it, but there is kind of the idea that there were high priests of Moloch which came to Malta at some point and they were doing ritual sacrifices, explaining to them why they needed to do that to keep the demon at bay. And the people of Malta are like, yeah, that's fine, that's cool, we'll get on board with that because we've already been doing that for thousands of years to placate the snake forms that live under the island. So this draws all back on, the serpent worship ideas of the Neolithic that we spoke about just before. They use this story to then add validity to another story that allegedly happened in 1944, but wasn't reported until 1974 when the son of one of the people who experienced this event came out and decided to speak the truth. Apparently in 1944, a mining inspector had been called to investigate a cave-in at one of the Dixonville mines. About 15 men had either been killed or turned up missing altogether in the disaster. Once inside the mine, they came across the first victim. Although under a broken beam surrounded by fallen rocks and rubble, the cave-in certainly couldn't have been large enough to kill the man. The inspectors were shocked to find that the body of the miner was lacerated, with claw-like marks from some unknown creature. They continued and found a few other bodies, all dead, and some which had the similar claw-like marks covering them. Still, other miners were nowhere to be seen. This tragedy apparently took place after the miners had broken through into an ancient tunnel of unknown origin. This tunnel, at the time the inspectors didn't realise it was a recently discovered passage or drift, was then at a 45-degree angle for about half a mile into a room which seemed like the end of the passage. At this point, the passage behind them just happened to collapse. Many accounts indicate that these underground creatures can create cave-ins at will, as in the Malta incident. So what they're referring to there is thinking that, something that I forgot to mention, it's probably important to the story, is that apparently what happened when the children went missing after Miss Jessup had visited the caves and had that original kind of encounter, the story goes that teachers and the kids went into this same kind of cave and they had a rope that they were following, and as soon as the last kid entered into this cavern, which was the same one that Miss Jessup was in, apparently the room behind them collapsed, and when investigators went to try and find them and help them, they found that it looked like the rope that the children had been holding was severed, not just cut by the rocks. Then for a period of weeks after that, they could hear the screams of the teacher and the students, but they couldn't find where they were coming from, and eventually they just stopped. And it was that incident which caused the Maltese government to shut up the entrances to the caves. So after the miners, the inspectors had seen this collapse, a follow-up team had been sent to intersect the inspectors. And as they were digging through to kind of, get to the inspectors who are now, victims of a cave-in as well, the father of the man who released the story said that he suddenly felt something like hot breath on the back of his neck. He closed his eyes, too terrified to look at what the thing was. As the other workers were breaking through, the creature inexplicably left or was frightened away. And the other inspector, however, observed the whole thing, and in wild horror, he exclaimed that the thing was not of this world. So there's some crazy stories, and, quite compelling, I guess, to be proof of reptilians existing in subterranean ancient passageways, except for one problem, and that is that there is zero proof that either of those events actually truly happened. Also, I'm not the first person to try and find information on whether or not these things occurred, because another problem is the source. So apparently, this document and these stories were very, very popular on early internet boards in the 1990s. talking about reptilians and, the existence of these such creatures. There have been people before me, even as early as the early 2000s, who have been trying to find and verify who Constant Lois Jessup is. And even so far as going through, microfilm of the Malta times to try and find any kind of evidence that this event happened, because obviously, a whole bunch of school children and teachers disappearing and then allegedly being able to be heard in a cavern would make the news. It would make worldwide news when you think that people getting stuck in wells makes worldwide news. Like, this is not something that would have just slipped idly by, even in 1935, even in wartime, but actually happened a little bit later. I mean, you could explain it away by saying that perhaps maybe there was some kind of media blackout about it because it was quite terrifying, and maybe it was something which authorities knew about, but that is going into deep kind of conspiracy there. It is possible. We are speaking about reptilian humanoids after all, and so therefore anything's possible. And, it kind of also a question of what comes first, the chicken or the egg, when it comes to Lois Jessup. Like, was she the secretary of the New York Saucer Information Bureau because of her experience earlier in Malta? Or did she make that story up? And is she like a disinformation agent, like Ivan T. Sanderson was, suspect of that organization? Did that have anything to do with it? The same arguments could be made for the Dixonville story as well. Like, the alleged newspaper source from 1974, which was circulated in the 1990s, there's no proof of that newspaper even existing. There's a lot of bloggers that have tried to looked into it and try and find it, and have even reached out to local librarians in the area and people who study mine collapses, and they have no record of a mine collapse in 1944 killing 15 people, and let alone having any kind of claw marks or encounters with otherworldly beings and ancient chasms. And I guess that's the thing, like, that's the nature of this game, is that there is never going to be a smoking gun moment, and maybe they very well did happen, but I guess from the outset, I'm inclined to think that this is an example of an early 90s internet hoax that, I guess because it's been put in a Ministry of Defense declassified document in 2008, it almost gives it more validity because people don't fact check the source or potential stories behind it. So I don't know. I think these ones are debunked. I think that they've been made up. But the Lois Jessup rabbit hole is a fun one. And I feel like if you do have a rainy afternoon where you want to kind of look into some stuff, I feel like that's a fun one to kind of get into. Like, I'll be honest, I even looked on ancestry.com. I even tried to look up like military records and things like that to find out if there was anyone by that name in Malta in the 1930s. Anything. And if this is something like an off the cuff kind of thought, if there was any validity to the claims that Queen Elizabeth II was a reptilian shapeshifter, blood-sucking creature, it would have made more sense for them to put this timeline for this made-up story around the time when she was living in Malta. That would have made way more sense and would have been way more kind of compelling evidence for this wider conspiracy. Now, it would be entirely unfair of me to completely discount this phenomena based on two accounts from a 1990s internet hoax. Mainly in this episode, I've done nothing but debunk this phenomena. Well, I guess debunk alleged claims of proof of this phenomena from David Icke and the like. I think that that's an important differentiation to make, is that, and I have this conversation with my colleagues and scientists and friends and family of mine all the time, that it's like the expression of the human experience and being able to tell people's stories. Like, I'm not in a position to say whether or not those stories are true or not. But I do believe that when you are, looking to come from a place of finding the truth or being truthful, that you can't sit here and deceive an audience or, propagate some kind of myth or legend that has no basis in it, especially when it attempts to come from a place of authority. Like someone expressing a personal story that happened to them, like that's anecdotal at best anyway. You can't prove that. But when people start trying to cite like newspaper articles and all kinds of things like that as proof of something happening, when you can't even back up those claims, like the thing about it is that because now we're in this technological age where we're able to cite things that happened on the internet 25 years ago, that doesn't mean that it's proof that it happened. It's just proof that we were talking about it 25 years ago, that someone made up a story 25 years ago. So I'm more compelled to believe individual stories that I read on a random Reddit post or on, some kind of website like Phantoms and Monsters that have been submitted to somebody that's looked up a Fortean researcher. They could very well be made up as well. But in my mind, it's not like it's presented in a package with the intent to deceive or push some other agenda. So I don't know, from my perspective, I prefer those kinds of stories as opposed to stories that are, presented in a neat little package in a book or in some kind of alleged secret document. So citing Lon Strickler's website again, in 2015 he created a blog post where he says that a few years ago he asked people to reach out to him if they have ever had any kind of experience with reptilian humanoids. The gentleman got in touch with him that says he had an experience with reptilian humanoids in the 1970s while he was serving as a corporal in the US Army deployed to South Vietnam. So in 1970, this gentleman says he was deployed to South Vietnam and was in a region about 30 miles south of the DMZ. At the time, he was second in command of this squadron of soldiers. They were moving through a section of jungle that had a few steep hills and were ordered to patrol one of the small valleys west of their encampment. Not long after entering one of the small valleys, they detected some kind of movement ahead of us, but it seemed to be kind of scattered. They doubted that it was the Viet Cong, but they also weren't 100% positive that it wasn't. So they hunkered down for about 15 minutes and were still getting occasional glimpses of something moving through the trees and the brush. But there wasn't enough light to detect what they were observing, though the moonlight was bright. Adds an additional creepy kind of element to the story. It kind of makes me immediately think of Jurassic Park. After a while, they hadn't noticed any activity, so they continued to move slowly through the valley. As they approached, a sheer wall on the hill looked like someone or something had stacked large stones and boulders in the path in front of them. There was also an opening in the side of the hill that looked like a cave entrance. It was approximately 5 foot high and 3 foot wide, narrowing at the top. When observing the passageway, it appeared to be cut away by machinery. The edges were smooth and even had small, even-spaced grooves. They were puzzled by this because they had never seen any enemy caves like this, just underground tunnels. The sergeant suggested that it might be a supply depot, so we started to assess how we were going to investigate the cave, and it was around about this time that things got very strange. The moment they tried to enter the cave, a putrid odour emanated from it. The only thing that they can compare it to was the smell of rotting eggs and of human decay. It was so revolting that a few of the soldiers were becoming ill and started to back away into the jungle, including the sergeant. The guy who wrote the story said he directed a light into the entrance in order to observe anything, but there was a haze that made it impossible to see through. The entire squad took a position in the heavy brush approximately 150 feet from the entrance, far enough not to be detected but close enough to observe the cave. We remained quietly there for what seemed like forever. The jungle was strangely calm, though we heard a strange rumbling sound coming from the distance. It was really eerie. The sergeant was sitting near him, talking to himself. It was obvious that he was frightened. I was looking at the rest of the squad. Each had eyes wide and scanning the area. No one was going to doze off during this patrol. After several hours, dawn was approaching and it started to lighten up. I checked my watch. It was just before 500 hours. Just then, we noticed movement from in front of the cave. A being, I first thought was a man, moved through the entrance of the cave into the clearing in the front of the cave. As it stood up, From a crouch, it stood at least 7 foot high and started looking directly at us. At that time, another similar-looking creature was moving out of the cave. They were making hellish hissing sounds and looking directly at us. The only way I can describe these beings is that they looked like upright lizards, with scaly, shiny skin that was very dark, almost black, snake-like faces with forward-set eyes that were very large. They had arms and legs like a human, but with scaly skin. I didn't notice the tail, though they wore long one-piece dark green robes, along with a dark cap-looking cover on their heads. I never noticed if they had anything on their feet. No one gave the order. It seemed like an entire squad opened fire at once. Every piece of vegetation between us and them was quickly sheared away. I yelled out a ceasefire order at the same time I was looking in the direction of the cave. There was nothing there. We immediately checked our flank in case these things had circled behind us. There was nothing. As we approached the cave, ready to resume action if needed, it became apparent that the beings had escaped, most likely back into the cave. It was soon decided to set charges and close the cage entrance. We returned to camp. We all seemed to be in a daze. There was a little discussion of the incident and we were never debriefed. So I know the sergeant never filed a report. Then again, if he did, it was probably kept quiet by the brass. Interestingly, in recent times, there are people who make claims that there is a race of reptilian humanoids living in the world's largest cave in Vietnam called Son Dong. But something kind of really bizarre that I've realized is if you look at any kind of modern articles that talk about this, it seems like they are referencing the Phantoms and Monsters 2015 article, because it was in 2015 that a man came out with a photo that he said he took in 1992 inside the cave that has an image of a reptilian in it, which I would say is pareidolia at best. But it's kind of funny because there's lots of kind of modern articles that cite both of the stories that I've just mentioned that come from Lon Strickler's website, but they are also stories that Lon Strickler references to prove his point. So it's like they're referencing each other. I mean, there are so many personal accounts that we could sink our teeth into. Like, my personal favourites are the Loveland Frog, and then there's that other kind of one of that creature that kind of came out and attacked that dude's car and apparently tried to bite its fender off. Like, that's another one of my personal favourites. And I reckon that that's about where we should leave it for today. You know, it's one of those things, like I mentioned in the last episode, that it's like a giant web. Like, you can't unpack the phenomena or even just an entity in one hour episode. You know, you have to kind of take your time and really be in it for the long haul. So I think that this is a pretty good introduction to it though. And, you know, I think getting the whole David Icke conversation out of the way kind of helps. I think there is a lot more to kind of be unpacked there with the history of it, but I don't know. I want you to let me know what you think. Have you ever seen a reptilian humanoid for yourself? Have you ever smelt that kind of sulfury smell? Is there some element of truth that it could potentially be a demonic spirit? You know, the Vietnam encounter said that they could smell sulfur. Sulfur is associated with demonic possession. And also the type C greys that are said to be reptilian apparently emit that kind of sulfury smell. So, I don't know, maybe there is something to that. I'd love for you to let me know. Oh, and just one thing before I let you go. I did look a little bit more into the Arizona Wilder story, even though I said that I wouldn't. And one thing which was like super interesting is when I looked into the neurosurgeon that she said claimed to do all of the experiments on her, I did find that his associate that he did a lot of work with, a lot of his work was actually funded by the Rothschilds. So I'm just going to leave you with that. You can do with that what you want. Okay, so that's going to be about it from me tonight. If you're still here, please do me a solid and go and like this video and subscribe to my channels. I also have the other podcast now, which is Keeping It Supernatural, which is more like a second channel, which is just going to be where I'm able to wax lyrical about any kind of strange stuff without any kind of rhyme or reason. So that's the only reason why I kind of created it, was to give me a little bit more kind of freedom artistically with what I want to create, whilst keeping this channel kind of a little bit more concentrated on a specific subject. So yeah, if you would like to see what else I can come up with over there, then subscribe to the YouTube channel and follow me on Instagram. That would help me out a lot. Thank you so much. Thank you for your company, and I will be seeing you very soon. Bye bye. Ciao.